treasures of his bright design, and works his gracious will. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take, the clouds ye so much dread are big with mercy and shall bring in blessings on your head. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind the frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. The invitation hymn, if you'll mark in the front of your book, the letter A, what will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus? What a great question for an invitation hymn. Now turn to James chapter 4. And I want to read verses 13 through 17 to set the stage for our lesson this morning. So James 4, 13 to 17. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. And as it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. What a very appropriate Bible passage for today, since this is January the 1st, New Year, and people are making all kinds of New Year's resolutions. Some people make the resolution not to make any resolutions. I've seen that. But a lot of people are kind of in the practice of thinking about, okay, last year didn't go so well, so what do I need to change for this year? And people make New Year's resolutions. It's interesting when you think about this, because how appropriate it is that James is going to talk about making plans for the future. And this is so important for those of us who are Christians, to how we are to think and how we're to operate in making plans for the future. It's so interesting that this is such an important topic that in the book of James, he's going to devote an entire paragraph to this. So there's a lot of good stuff in here. Some people think, remember we talked about James being the wisdom literature of the New Testament? Well, some people think that it's Proverbs 27 verse 1 that may have guided James' thinking of some of this, but look at Psalms 27:1. He says, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. So that's Proverbs 27:1. Well, it almost sounds like some of what we just read here, doesn't it? James is going to take it a little bit further than the proverb He's actually going to make an application with this principle. So this new year, we ask the question, how are we who are Christians to make plans for the future? And is it wise to plan for the future? Well, we would say, well, yeah, you want to plan for the future. We know people who didn't, and look where they ended up. So we understand the wisdom of planning for the future, whether it's financial or whether it's, your living situation, whether it is other things related to your well-being. We do understand the wisdom of that. But James is going to start off with a word of caution and warning. He goes, now listen. One translation says, come down. So it's an invitation to come and sit at the feet of the wisdom teacher. Come down and listen. So these words of caution and warning are important for living. All of you probably got, among your Christmas gifts, you probably have a favorite. You're like, oh, wow, that's great. I got that as a gift. Well, Nancy got me an electric hand planer for my wood shop. And I'm so excited about starting to use it. But it was funny because when I pulled it out of the box, the instructions kept going. And I mean, they kept going. And I was like, oh my goodness, look at this. And you know that most of that was caution and warning on how to use it. I'm like, oh, don't people know how to use these? Well, it's, I think at one level, it's so the company could figure out how nobody could sue them if somebody used it wrong. I mean, there's always litigation behind people's thinking. But the other is an electric planer can be a dangerous tool if you don't know how to use it right. And the blade on it's really sharp, and so you got to know how to use it and everything. And I thought it was interesting to think about instructions when you buy something always come with all of these warnings and cautions. And honestly, if you think about it, it's so that you can get the best use out of that appliance or that tool, because you don't want to misuse it or use it. So here he's giving us words of direction and warning. And this practice of warning using this language is used by James again. We will have a future lesson, the Lord willing. Look at chapter 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people. So he said here in chapter 4, now listen, you who say, and then chapter 5:1, he'll begin again. Now listen. So he wants people in the congregation to really pay attention to what he's saying, because they need the instructions and the warnings that he's going to give. It's almost like he's saying, okay, enough is enough, listen up. That's kind of how we would say it. Okay, enough's enough, listen up. And he's going to deal specifically with intentional planning. Those of you who are saved, listen up. So it sounds like there are specific individuals among the congregation that he's aware of that have been guilty of making plans, but they've been missing something very important. He's going to talk about that. And he said, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city. So they're plotting and they're planning to go where the greatest opportunity for profit exists. Now, from an American cultural perspective, we're like, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, if I were planning for a business, wouldn't I want to go to this city or that, and have profit and do well with my business? Well, there's still more to the picture. In fact, someone could point out, well, what about Luke 14, the parable that Jesus tells, where he talks about intentional planning and how important that is? Listen to this parable. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. And then he gives an illustration. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete the tower? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you and say, this person began to build when they would finish. So in this little parable, Jesus is giving, telling this little story, the importance of counting the cost of being a disciple, and he uses the illustration of planning. So planning is okay. In fact, he gives it here for this particular illustration. But the parable, it underscores the necessity of counting the cost when following Jesus. So this kind of intentional planning that Jesus gives in the parable is counting the cost, and you could consider it as spiritual wisdom. What James is talking about, those opposite kind of plan. It's one that I would call based on earthly wisdom. Because in chapter 4, we'll have a lesson, the Lord willing, in the future, where we're going to look at the contrast between earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. Well, earthly wisdom is a kind of planning that where it's purely earthly, and it has no idea, or there's no intention of it being wrapped around faithful discipleship. Plans are to spend a year there, trade, and make profit. And again, nothing wrong with that principle, but it's interesting how we're going to see in a moment that there's a huge element missing. I went online, there's all kinds of, if you've ever tried to put together business plans for someone, all kind of templates on the internet of how to create business plans. And so I was looking through all of them, and one of them is called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Planning Your Own Business. and as you know, there's a whole series of books, The Complete Idiot's Guide to so-and-so. You can find almost anything that you want. What is missing, and if you look at all the templates, look at all the literature, what is missing in all of that stuff is exactly what James is going to point out. People planning for the future, but leaving the Lord out of the picture. And we're going to talk about that. Now, there has been a movement in America among missionaries, and this has been about 20 years now. And when people talk about it, they just use the word BAM, B-A-M. But that stands for business as missions. And there's been an intention among missionaries to receive some kind of training. You may be an electrician, you may be a plumber, whatever your training is, but you intentionally go into another country, and your real business is not necessarily making money so you can make a living, although that's important. The most important thing is they want to be kind of like, remember Paul? Paul was this tent maker, and he talks about being a tent maker. It's being a modern day tent maker. You go as a missionary, and you support yourself by your job, but your main reason there, you know that's why you're there. You're trying to support yourself, but your number one reason is sharing the gospel, proclaiming the good news to people that don't know Jesus, and you're self-supported. So there's been a real movement toward that since the year 2000, but it's called BAM, Business as Missions. And I know some people that are functioning in that mode, and I always pray for them because that's a wonderful model, because you are intentionally planning your business to be successful so that you can support yourself. But your number one concern is with the gospel. You're taking it people that don't know Jesus. So the clear message at this point, nothing wrong with intentional planning, but we see in a moment what that intentional planning must include. James gives a reminder here that it's so basic you wonder why he would have to say it. But it's a humble reminder. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. Have you discovered in your life this phrase, because of the way things have happened? And maybe think back to 2022. You've heard of this. Life turns on a dime. Have you ever heard that expression? So that things will happen you never dreamed of, never saw it coming. And so with humility, we have to be reminded, yeah, life turns on a dime. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Ecclesiastes 8 verse 7 says this: since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what's to come? You know, and it was interesting because in the ancient world, you had a whole lot of soothsayers. Oh my. Yeah, even in Paul's day, but in the ancient world, people made a living by predicting the future, soothsayers. They were a dime a dozen everywhere. And people were so superstitious. But no human being knows the future. So what right do I have to tell people what tomorrow is going to be like? And so James is saying, we just have to come to the point. We know that we don't know the future. But then he asks a question which goes even a little deeper than that. What is your life? Oh, the Bible's always quick to remind us how short and how uncertain life can be. It pulls no punches. Listen to a few of these verses. Of course, here in James, he's going to give the illustration of a vapor or a mist. Well, when we came to service this morning, the vapor, mist, the fog, it was really heavy. Well, what happens though? After the sun comes out in a few hours, it burns off and the fog is gone. And that's what James says. It's like a mist or a vapor. Oh, it's gone. That's just how tenuous life is. Job 7:6. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and come to an end without hope. Have you ever watched a weaver's shuttle? I think I've seen it on TV, and we went to a historical reproduction of a fort once where someone was doing a weaver's shuttle. But a person that's good, they'll take that thing and shove it back and forth through the pieces of cloth. But then when they're done with the rug, it's over. And it's interesting that he uses the illustration of a weaver shuttle back and forth. That's how quick life is. First Chronicles 29:15. For we are sojourners before you, O Lord, and tenants, as all our fathers were. Our days on earth are like a shadow. So life is like a shadow. And Job 8:9, the same thing. Our days on earth are like a shadow. Psalm 78:39. Thus he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and does not return. The other day we were out, this was back about 2 weeks ago. It was when it was still nice and warm before the cold would hit. We were out in the front yard and I was helping Nancy rake some leaves. And there was a strong wind that afternoon. And you could really hear it because the neighbors had these pine trees and that wind was up in the pine trees. Then all of a sudden the wind died down and it quit. I was like, whoa, it's just like somebody, shut it off. But wind comes and it's gone. And the wind, our life is like a wind that comes and goes. And then in 1 Peter 2, all men are like grass and flowers of the field that wither and the blooms fall off. Whoa. So you can read scripture after scripture. When you start looking at the way the Bible looks at it, folks, we're not going to be here long. Life is short and it's tenuous. It's uncertain. Constant reminder that we're living on borrowed. You ever heard someone say we're living on borrowed time? Now, James is going to take this toward what I call a moral imperative. Here's what you ought to say. And it caused me to think about this week. There are a lot of people today who don't like the idea that living the Christian life has parameters and do's and don'ts. But there are moral absolutes. There are moral imperatives. There are moral guidelines that we have to follow to be God's children. And they're all for our best. God knows what we need because he made us. Now, what James is going to say, here's what you ought to say in place of what you're saying. But if the Lord should will it, and this is the core of it all, it's a recognition that life is not lived on our own terms, but on the condition of the Lord's actually willing and bringing about something to pass, so that when we start making plans, guess what? We're joining God's plans that are unfolding and already in progress. The world does not revolve around me and my plans. That's always been hard for me to accept. Because I'm a person that likes to make lists and check things off and get her done, okay? But it's not about me. It's about God's will being done in this world. And when I make plans, I have to intentionally think, and James is saying you ought to say verbally, well, if the Lord wills. My grandmother, all the time, she would say, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. She would always say that. And it's interesting because at the back of their property, they had a little creek where we'd fish all the time. I was always afraid that what she was saying as a little kid was, boy, if the Lord's not willing, that creek's going to come up and flood the whole farm. So as a little kid, I was like, okay, I hope the Lord stayed willing. But she would have that expression. And I've often wondered, people years ago, when they would say that, I suspect if they thought about it, they knew why they were saying it. And I know that sometimes it became sort of second nature, but it expressed something that I think's been lost in our culture. That people often don't say that, if the Lord willing, if it's the Lord's will. You don't hear people say that very much. And James is so strong about this that he's going to say something that I want to keep a verse in context, because out of context it's going to drive you nuts. The last verse of this paragraph, what does he say? If a person knows to do good and doesn't do it, what is it? Really? Oh my. There's a lot of good I know to be doing and I'm not doing it. Am I that bad of a sinner? Well, let's look at what James is really saying here. Because I love that he said it at the end of this paragraph. And all that clears it up, you just have to ask this question. What is the good that he's talking about? Well, it's very specific. The good that he's talking about is being able, because you know it's right and you ought to do it, being able, when you make plans for the future, especially like here, you're making life plans to, start a business. When you make plans for the future like that, you need to include the Lord in your plans. That's the good. And it's so important for James that he's going to say, if you don't do that, if you make plans in the future and you leave the Lord out, that's a sin. Wow. Because what does he say? Look at what he's dealing with. He's saying, those of you who are boasting and bragging, and here, I've often wished James could have given us more information here, but I'm assuming in that congregation there were people who were making some pretty big, grandiose plans about making money and setting up business and going places in different cities, and they were just bragging about it. And James is like, no, that's not really good for Christians to be bragging to one another what you think you're going to be able to accomplish. It's not bragging. The Christian life doesn't center around what you're doing and you bragging about it. No. You need to be very humble about it. Boy, there's a lot in the small letter of James about humility. Probably more in James than any other place in the New Testament. If you exalt yourself, guess what? God's going to bring you low. But if you have a humble attitude, guess what? God's going to exalt you. And that principle, I think, holds true here for planning for the future. Think of how many people have been overconfident in planning for the future, even with jobs, even with business plans. But they were so proud about it, and then all of a sudden, things went south, things went sour, and they lost everything and didn't learn a thing from it. Well, here, James is saying, I want you to be aware that when you get caught up in this arrogant boasting, he's even going to say it's evil. Now, there's a lot of things in life that through the years I have sort of put in the category of evil. And I've got my list of evil things I think I've seen in the world. I don't think for a number of years I thought that this was evil. You just don't like to be around people who brag and boast. But James saying, no, it's just not being uncomfortable around those kind of people. It's deeper than that. When you leave God out like this, and you're bragging and boasting, and that's your whole approach to life, that's evil. I'm like, really? That's evil? Yeah, that's evil. I mean, it kind of makes you sit up and take notice, doesn't it? Listen to Proverbs 16:5. Everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Be assured he will not go unpunished. Now, that's in the Bible. Maybe we need to hear this more often. Proverbs 21:24. Scoffer is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. It's interesting that for the book of Proverbs, if you're an arrogant person, it's like you're scoffing at God. It's like, I'm in control. I don't think God knows what he's up to. God doesn't know what I need. I know what I need. And the book of Proverbs presents it as a person who scoffs against God. So the good here is really important. It's interesting that in the wisdom literature, the book of Proverbs, oh my, there's so many good things in the book of Proverbs. I wasn't aware of it till this week, but listen to two from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 2:20. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. The person that is good in the book of Proverbs is the one that seeks the Lord. So you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. When you let wisdom dictate your steps, he's saying you're going to have success. That's the way life ought to be when you walk in the ways of wisdom. And when we ignore the oughts, what we've learned, James says we might be saying that with the New Year's resolution, if we're trying to make all kinds of plans for this year without a thought of how God fits in those plans, it's a sin. So I was reading all this in view of today. I was like, boy, I better be careful with my New Year's resolutions this year. I want to make sure that anything I think about, anything I'm planning, God's right in the middle of all of that. He says, therefore, knowing this, it has the force of saying something like this. Once we know how we ought to speak about and plan for the future, with the Lord in the middle of our plans, we have no excuse to view the future from secular eyes that omit the Lord. You as a Christian, when you make plans, you make it different from a non-Christian. That's fascinating, isn't it? The word for sin here too is interesting. It's failing to hit the mark. It's a bad action or an evil deed. In the New Testament, it's always looking at something right versus wrong, whether it's in thought and feeling or in speech and action. So this whole lesson on boasting about tomorrow and planning for the future is really timely for New Year's Day. Because we want our thoughts and our planning and our future this year to be in the hands of the Lord. And what a difference that makes as a Christian. Here, I get the sense that if James were here this morning and we could talk to him, he would be saying something like, what I'm trying to get at is that the wisest and the most successful way to live, doesn't matter if you're planning business or planning your future, but the wisest and the most successful is when you keep me, the Lord, right in the middle of your plans. Okay, that's a good word, isn't it? And we need to hear that. So this morning, maybe the challenge has been for you that you haven't as intentionally been including the Lord in your thoughts and in your plans. But the Christian practice of planning for the future takes into account the Lord's will. And we know that as James is giving these words of wisdom, intentional planning is okay. He's not throwing that out the window, but he wants it to be intentional planning with the Lord kind of sitting beside you, helping make those plans. He reminds us that we can't know the future, and life is so tenuous, and that this moral imperative is what we ought to say, that if it's the Lord's will, we'll do this or that. And that boasting of arrogant schemes, braggadocio kind of spirit about what we're doing, that's evil. As Christians, we just need to stay away from it. And that the good here, in proper context, is including the Lord in your plans. And what a blessing that is. Are we ready to come to God and Jesus this morning? Give up our hearts that have embraced only a self-centered, arrogant lifestyle. That describes so many people, doesn't it? So let's embrace in our life the grace of God and the divine gift of wisdom to understand what to say and how to include God when we make plans. May God grant us the wisdom and the courage and the tenacity of faith to embrace this kind of life that seeks to be aware at every minute what God is up to. See, I love this idea. God, I'm making plans today, or I'm making plans for tomorrow. What are you up to? To have that as a thought. God, what are you up to? Help me join that. What are you up to? It's a great thought. So if you need to respond to the invitation in any way, for any reason, let us stand and sing. What will you do with Jesus? Jesus is standing in Pilate's hall, friendless for sin.